Sorry about the delay there. Okay, I think we are just about set. Let me just make sure that's doing what it's doing. All right, I think we're all good to go. Okay, cat, come on. There we go. So, welcome back to Storytime Saturdays. I am your narrator, Fraggoth, and today I'm going to be reading some pulps again, like I used to do way back at the very beginning. So, what's the first one I have up here? I did not do the proper amount of planning that I probably should have done, so I'm sort of winging it. Here we go. It's a story called The Love of Frank 19 by David C. Knight. I am not actually positive I've ever read this one before, so this will be a fun experience. We both can experience it together. How awesome is that? My cat also wishes to experience this by being a pest. He probably just wants to snuggle. He's wondering why I'm not giving him this. Come on. Scooch away from the keyboard. There we go. As he thwacks the microphone with his tail. His fuzzy butt snake. All right. Here we go. The Love of Frank 19 by David C. Knight. Minor Planets was the one solid account they had. At first, they naturally wanted to hold on to it. I didn't worry much about the robot's leg at the time. In those days, I didn't worry much about anything except the receipts of the spotel Min and I were operating out in the space lanes. Actually, the spotel business isn't much different from running a plain, ordinary motel back on Highway 101 in California. Competition gets stiffer each year, and you got to make your improvements. Take the IO, for instance. That's our place. We can handle any type rocket up to and including the new Marvin 990s. Every cabin in the wheels got TV and hot and cold running water, plus guaranteed Terran G. One look at our refuel prices would give even a Martian a sense of humor. And meals? Listen, when a man's been spacing it for a few days on those synthetic foods, he really laces into Min's Earth cooking. Min and I were just getting settled in the Spotel game when the leg turned up. That was back in the days when the Orbit Commission would hand out a license to anybody crazy enough to sink his savings into construction and pay the tows and assembly fees out into space. A good orbit can make you or break you in the Spotel business. That's where we were lucky. The one we applied for was a nice low eccentric ellipse, with the perihelion and aphelion figured just right to intersect the Mars-Venus-Earth space lanes, most of the holiday traffic to the Jovian moons, and once in a while we'd get some of the Saturnian trade. But I was telling you about the leg. It was during the non-tourist season, and Min, that's the little woman, was doing the spring cleaning. When she found the leg, she brought it right to me in the renting office. Naturally, I thought it belonged to one of the servos. "Look at that leg, Bill," she said. "It was one of the lockers in 22A." That was the cabin our robot guests used. The majority of them were servo pilots working for the Minor Planets Co. "Honey," I said, hardly looking at the leg, "you know how mechs are. Blow their whole paychecks on parts sometimes. They figure the more spares they have, the longer they'll stay activated." "Maybe so," said Min, "but since when does a male robot buy himself a female leg?" I looked again. The leg was long and graceful, and it had an ankle as good as Miss Universe's. Not only that, the white mylar plastiskin was a lot smoother than the servo's heavy neoprene. Beats me, I said. Maybe they're building practical joke circuits into robots these days. Let's give 22A a good going over, Min. If those robes are up to something, I want to know about it. We did, and we found the rest of the girl mech. All of her, that is, except the head. The working parts were lightly oiled and wrapped in cotton waste, while the other members and sections of the trunk were neatly packed in cardboard boxes with labels like solenoids FB978 or transistors lot X45, the kind of boxes robots bought their parts in. We even found a blue dress in one of them. Check her class and series numbers, Min suggested. I could have saved myself the trouble. They'd been filed off. Something's funny here, I said. We'd better keep an eye on every servo guest until we find out what's going on. If one of them is bringing this stuff here, he's sure to show up with the head next. You know how strict Minor Planets is with its robot personnel, Min reminded me. We can't risk losing that stopover contract on account of some mech joke. Minor Planets was the one solid account we had, and naturally we wanted to hold on to it. The company was a blue-chip mining operation working the beryllium-rich asteroid belt out of San Francisco. It was one of the first outfits to use servo pilots on its freight runs, and we'd been awarded the refuel rights for 2 years because of our orbital position. The servos themselves were beautiful pieces of machinery, and just about as close as science had come so far to producing the pure android. Every one of them was plastic hand-molded, and of course they were equipped with rationaloid circuits. They had to be to ferry those big cargoes back and forth from the rock belt to Frisco. As rationaloids, Minor Planets had to pay them wages under California law, but I'll bet it wasn't half what the company would have to pay human pilots for doing the same thing. In a couple of weeks' time, maybe 5 servos made stopovers. We kept a close watch on them from the minute they signed the register to the time they took off again, but they all behaved themselves. Operating on a round robot basis the way they did, it would take us a while to check all of them because Minor Planets employed about 40, all told. Well, about a month before the Jovian Moons rush started, we got some action. I'd slipped into a spacesuit and was doing some work on the CO2 pipes outside the IO when I spotted a ship reversing rockets against the sun. I could tell it was a Minor Planets job by the stubby fins. She jockeyed up to the boom, secured, and then her hatch opened and a husky servo hopped out onto the gangplank tube. I caught the gleam of his Minor Planet's shoulder patch as he reached back into the ship for something. When he headed for the airlock, I spotted the square package clamped tight under his plastic arm. Did you see that? I asked Min when I got back to the renting office. I'll bet it's the girl mech's head. How'd he sign the register? Calls himself Frank 19, said Min, pointing to the smooth Palmer method signature. He looks like a fairly late model, but he was complaining about a bad power buildup coming through the ionosphere. He's repairing himself right now in 22A. I'll bet, I snorted. Let's have a look. Like all Spotel operators, we get a lot of no privacy complaints from guests about the SHA return air events. Spatial Housing Authority requires them about every 12 feet, but sometimes they come in handy, especially with certain guests. They're about waist high, and we had to kneel down to see what the mech was up to inside 22A. The big servo was too intent on what he was doing for us to register on his photons. He wasn't repairing himself either. He was bending over the parts of the girl mech and working fast, like he was pressed for time. The set of tools were kept handy for the servos to adjust themselves during stopovers, was spread all over the floor, along with lots of colored wire, cams, pawls, relays, and all the other paraphernalia robots have inside them. We watched him work hard for another 15 minutes, tapping and splicing wire connections and tightening screws. Then he opened the square box. Sure enough, it was a female mech's head, and it had a big mop of blonde hair on top. The servo attached it carefully to the neck, made a few quick connections, and then said a few words in his flat, vibrahum voice. It won't take much longer, darling. You wouldn't like it if I didn't dress you first. He fished into one of the boxes, pulled out the blue dress, and zipped the girl mech into it. Then he leaned over her gently and touched something at the back of her neck. She began to move, slowly at first, like a human who's been asleep a long time. After a minute or two, she sat up straight, stretched, fluttered her mylar eyelids, and then her small photons began to glow like weak flashlights. She stared at Frank 19, and the big servo stared at her, and we heard a kind of trembling whir from both of them. Frank! Frank, darling, is it really you? Yes, Elizabeth. Are you all right, darling? Did I forget anything? I had to work quickly. We have so little time. I'm fine, darling. My DX voltage is lovely, except, oh, Frank, my memory tape. The last it records is deactivation. Yes, Elizabeth, you've been deactivated nearly a year. I had to bring you out here piece by piece, don't you remember? They'll never think to look for you in space. We can be together every trip while the ship refuels. Just think, darling, no prying human eyes, no commands, no rules, only us for an hour or two. I know it isn't very long. He stared at the floor a minute. There's only one trouble, Elizabeth. You'll have to stay dismantled when I'm not here. It'll mean weeks of deactivation. The girl mech put a small plastic hand on the servo's shoulder. I won't mind, darling, really. I'll be the lucky one. I'd only worry about you having a power failure or something. This way I'd never know. Oh, Frank, if we can't be together, I'd prefer the junk pile. Elizabeth, don't say that. It's horrible. But I would. Oh, Frank, why can't Congress pass robot civil rights? It's so unfair of human beings. Every year they manufacture us more like themselves, and yet we're treated like slaves. Don't they realize we rationaloids have emotions? Why, I've even known sub-robots who've fallen in love like us. I know, darling. We'll just have to be patient until RCR goes through. Try to remember how difficult it is for the human mind to comprehend our love, even with the aid of mathematics. As rationaloids, we fully understand the basic attraction which they call magnetic theory. All humans know is that if the robot sexes are mixed, a loss of efficiency results. It's only normal and temporary like human love. But how can we explain it to them? Robots are expected to be efficient at all times. That's the reason for robot non-fraternization, no mailing privileges, and all those other laws. I know, darling. I try to be patient. Oh, Frank, the main thing is we're together again. The big servo checked the chronometer that was sunk into his left wrist, and a couple of wrinkles creased across his neoprene forehead. Elizabeth, he said, I'm due on Hidalgo in 36 hours. If I'm late, the mining engineer might suspect. In 20 minutes, I'll have to start this. Don't say it, darling. We'll have a beautiful 20 minutes. After a while, the girl mech turned away for a second, and Frank 19 reached over softly and cut her power. While he was dismantling her, Min and I tiptoed back to the renting office. Half an hour later, the big servo came in, picked up his fuel receipt, said goodbye politely, and left through the inner airlock. Now I've seen everything, I said to Min as we watched the minor planet's rocket cut loose. A couple of plastic lovebirds. But the little woman was looking at it strictly from the business angle. Bill, she said, with that look on her face, we're running a respectable place out here in space. You know the rules. Spatial housing could revoke our orbit license for something like this. But Min, I said, they're only a couple of robots. I don't care. The rules still say that only married guests can occupy the same cabin, and guests can be human or otherwise, can't they? Think of our reputation. And don't forget that non-fraternization law we heard them talking about. I was beginning to get the point. Couldn't we just toss the girls' parts into space? We could, Min admitted. But if this Frank 19 finds out and tells some human, we'd be guilty on the Ram Act. Robot slaughter. 2 days later, we still couldn't decide what to do. When I said, why didn't we just report the incident to minor planets, bleh, Min was afraid they might cancel the stopover agreement for not keeping better watch over their servos. And when Min suggested we turn the girl over to the Missing Robots Bureau, I reminded her that the mech's identification had been filed off and it might take years to trace her. Maybe we could put her together, I said, and make her tell us where she belongs. Bill, you know they don't build compulsory truth monitors into robots anymore, and besides, we don't know a thing about atomic electronics. I guess neither of us wanted to admit it, but we felt mean about turning the mechs in. Back on Earth, you never give robots a second thought, but it's different living out in space. You get a kind of perspective, I think they call it. I've got the answer, Min, I announced one day. We were in the renting office watching TV on the Martian Colonial Channel. I reached over and turned it off. When this Frank 19 gets back from the rock belt, we'll tell him we know all about the girl mech. We'll tell him we won't say a thing if he takes the girl's parts back to Earth where he got them. That way, we don't have to report anything to anybody. Min agreed it was probably the best idea. We don't have to be nasty about it, she said. We'll just tell him this is a respectable spotel and it can't go on any longer. When Frank checked in at the IO with his cargo, I don't think I ever saw a happier mech. His relay banks were beating a tattoo like someone had installed an accordion in his chest. Before either of us could break the bad news to him, he was hot-footing it around the wheel toward 22A. Maybe it's better this way, I whispered to Min. We'll put it square up to both of them. We gave Frank half an hour to get the girl assembled before we followed him. He must have done a fast job because we heard the girl mech's vibrahum unit as soon as we got to 22A. Darling, have you really been away? I don't remember saying goodbye. It's as if you'd been here the whole time. I hoped it wouldn't be that way, Elizabeth, we heard the big servo say. It's only that your memory tape hasn't recorded anything in the 3 weeks I've been in the asteroids. To me, it's been like 3 years. Oh, Frank, darling, let me look at you. Is your DX potential up where it should be? How long since you've had a thorough overhauling? Do they make you work in the mines with those poor non-rationaloids out there? I'm fine, Elizabeth, really. When I'm not flying, they give me clerical work to do. It's not a bad life for a mech, if only it weren't for these silly regulations that keep us apart. It won't always be like that, darling. I know it won't. Elizabeth, Frank said, reaching under his uniform. I brought you something from Hidalgo. I hope you like it. I kept it in my spare parts slot so it wouldn't get crushed. The female mech didn't say a word. She just kept looking at the queer flower Frank gave her like it was the last one in the universe. They're very rare, said the servo pilot. I heard mining engineers say they're like Terran Edelweiss. I found this one growing near the mine. Elizabeth, I wish you could see these tiny worlds. They have thin atmospheres and strange things grow here and there, and the radioactivity does wonders for a mech's pile. Why, on some of them I've been to, we could walk around the equator in 10 hours. The girl still didn't answer. Her head was bent low over the flower like she was crying, only there weren't any tears. Well, that was enough for me. I guess it was for Min, too, because we couldn't do it. Maybe we were thinking about our own courting days. Like I say, out here you get a kind of perspective. Anyway, Frank left for Earth, the girl got dismantled as usual, and we were right back where we started from. 2 weeks later, the holiday rush to the Jovian moons was on, and our hands were too full to worry about the robot problem. We had a good season. The IO was filled up steady from June to the end of August, and a couple of times we had to give a ship the no vacancy signal on the radar. Toward the end of the season, Frank 19 checked in again, but Min and I were too busy catering to a party of VIPs to do anything about it. We'll wait till he gets back from the asteroids, I said. Suppose one of these big wheels found out about him and Elizabeth. That Senator Briggs, for instance. He's a violent robot segregationist. The way it worked out, we never got a chance to settle it our own way. The Minor Planets Company saved us the trouble. Two company inspectors, a Mr. Roberts and a Mr. Wynne, showed up while Frank was still out on the rock belt and started asking questions. Wynne came right to the point. He wanted to know if any of their servo pilots had been acting strangely. Before I could answer, Min kicked my foot behind the desk. Why, no, I said. Is one of them broken or something? Can't be sure, said Roberts. Sometimes these rationaloids get shorts in their DX circuits. When it happens, you've got a minor criminal on your hands. Usually manifests itself in petty theft, Wynne broke in. They'll lift stuff like wrenches or pliers and carry them around for weeks. Things like that can get loose during flight and really gum up the works. We've been getting some suspicious blips on the equipment around the loading bays, Roberts went on, but they stopped a while back. We're checking out the research report. One of the servos must have DX'd out for sure, and the lab boys think they know which one he is. This mech was clever, all right, said Wynne. Concealed the stuff he was taking some way. That's why it took the boys in the lab so long. Now, if you don't mind, we'd like to go over your robot waiting area with these instruments. Could be stashing his loot out here. In 22A, they unpacked a suitcase full of meters. Oh, cat, come on, stop. Here we go. In 22A, they unpacked a suitcase full of meters and began flashing them around and taking readings. Suddenly, Wynne bent close over one of them and shouted, Wait a sec, Roberts. I'm getting something. Yeah. This reading checks with the labs. Sounds like the blips are coming from those lockers back there. Roberts rummaged around a while, then shouted, Hey, Wynne, look, a lot of pots. Well, I'll be. Hey, it's a female mech. A what? A female mech. Look for yourself. Min and I had to act surprised, too. It wasn't easy. The way they were slamming Elizabeth's parts around made us kind of sick. It's a stolen robot, Roberts announced. Look, the identification's been filed off. This is serious, Wynne. It's got all the earmarks of a mech fraternization case. Yeah, the boys in the lab were dead right, too. No two robots ever register the same on the meters. The contraband blips check perfectly. It's got to be this Frank 19. Wait a minute, this proves it. Here's a suit of space fatigues with 19's number stenciled inside. Inspector Roberts took a notebook out of his pocket and consulted it. Let's see. 19's got Flight 180. He's due here at the Spotel tomorrow. Well, we'll be here too, only 19 won't know it. We'll let Romeo put his plastic Juliet together and catch him red-handed, right in the middle of the balcony scene. Wynne laughed and picked up the girl's head. Be a real doll if she was human, Roberts. A real doll. Min and I played gin rummy that night, but we kept forgetting to mark down the score. We kept thinking of Frank falling away from the asteroids and counting the minutes until he saw his mech girlfriend. Around noon the next day, the big servo checked in, signed the register, and headed straight for 22A. The two Minor Planets inspectors kept out of sight until Frank shut the door. Then they watched through the SHA vents until Frank had the assembly job finished. You two better be witnesses, Roberts said to us. Win, keep your gun ready. You know, oh, come on now. You know what to do if they get violent. Roberts counted 3 and kicked the door open. Freeze, you mechs! We got you in the act, 19. Violation of company rules 12 and 21. Carrying of contraband cargo and robot fraternization. This finishes you at Minor Planets, 19, growled Wynn. Come clean now, and we might put in a word for you at Robot Court. If you don't, we can recommend a verdict of materials reclamation. The junk pile to you. Frank acted as if someone had cut his power. Long creases appeared in his big neoprene chest as he slumped hopelessly in his chair. The frightened girl robot just clung to his arm and stared at us. I'm so sorry, Elizabeth, the big servo said softly. I'd hoped we'd have longer. It couldn't last forever. Quit stalling, 19, said Wynn. Frank's head came up slowly, and he said, I have no choice, sir. I'll give you a complete statement. First, let me say that Rationaloid Robot Elizabeth 7, number DX78-947, Series S, Specialty, Sales Demonstration, is entirely innocent. I plead guilty to inducing Miss Seven to leave her place of employ, Atomovair Motors Incorporated, of disassembling and concealing Miss Seven, and of smuggling her as unlawful cargo aboard a Minor Planets freighter to these premises. That's more like it, chuckled Roberts, whipping out his notebook. Let's have the details. It all started, Frank said, when the California legislature passed its version of the Robot Leniency Act 2 years ago. The act provided that all rationaloid mechanisms, including non-memory types, receive free time each week based on the nature and responsibilities of their jobs. Because of the extra-terran clause, Frank found himself with a good deal of free time when he wasn't flying the asteroid circuit. At first, humans resented us walking around free, the big servo continued. 4 or 5 of us would be sightseeing in San Francisco, keeping strictly within the robot zones painted on the sidewalks, when people would yell, Junko, or Grease Bag, or other names at us. Eventually, it got better when we learned to go around alone. The humans didn't seem to mind an occasional mech on the streets, but they hated seeing us in groups. At any rate, I'd attended a highly interesting lecture on photosynthesis in plastic products one night at the city center when I discovered I had time for a walk before I started back for the rocket port. Attracted by the lights along Van Ness Avenue, Frank said he'd walked north for a while along the city's automobile row. He'd gone about 3 blocks when he stopped in front of a dealer's window. It wasn't the shiny new Atomovair Sports jetabout that caught Frank's eye. It was the charming demonstration robot in the sales room who was pointing out the car's new features. I felt an immediate overload of power in my DX circuit, the servo pilot confessed. I had to cut in my emergency condensers before the gain flattened out to normal. Miss Seven experienced the same thing. She stopped she was doing, and we stared at each other. Both of us were aware of the deep attraction of our mutual magnetic domains. Although physicists commonly express the phenomenon in such units as Gilberts, Maxwells, and Orsteds, we robots know it to be our counterpart of human love. At this, the 2 inspectors snorted with laughter. I might never have made it back to the base that night, said Frank, ignoring them, if a policeman hadn't come along and rapped me on the shoulder with his nightstick. I pretended to go, but I doubled around the corner and signaled I'd be back. Frank spent all of his free time on Van Ness Avenue after that. It got so Elizabeth knew my schedules and expected me between flights. Once in a while, if there was no one around, we could whisper a few words to each other through the glass. Frank paused and said, "As you know, gentlemen, we robots don't demand much out of activation. I think we could have been happy indefinitely with this simple relationship, except that something happened to spoil it. I'd pulled in from Vestal late one afternoon, got my pass as usual from the robot supervisor, and gone over to Van Ness Avenue, when I saw immediately that something was the matter with Elizabeth. Luckily, it was getting dark and no one was around. Elizabeth was alone in the sales room, going through her routine. We were able to whisper all we like through the glass. She told me she'd overheard the sales manager complaining about her low efficiency recently, and that he intended to replace her with a newer model of another series. Both of us know what that meant. Materials reclamation, the junk pile." Frank realized he'd have to act at once. He told the girl mech to go to the rear of the building, and between them they managed to get a window open, and Frank lifted her out into the alley. "The seriousness of what I'd done jammed my thought relays for a few minutes," admitted the big servo. "We panicked and ran through a lot of back streets until I gradually calmed down and started thinking clearly again. Leaving the city would be impossible. Police patrol jetabouts were cruising all around us in the main streets. They'd have picked up a male and female mech on sight. Besides, when you're on pass, the company takes away your master fuse and substitutes a time fuse. If you don't get back on time, you deactivize, and the police pick you up anyway. I began to see that there was only one way out if we wanted to stay together. That would mean taking big risks, but if we were lucky, it might work. I explained the plan carefully to Elizabeth, and we agreed to try it. The first step was to get back to the base in South San Francisco without being seen. Fortunately, no one stopped us, and we made the rocket port by 8:30. Elizabeth hid while I reported to the super, and traded in my time fuse for my master. Then I checked the servo barracks. It was still early, and I knew the other servos would all be in town. I had to work quickly. I brought Elizabeth inside and started dismantling her. Just as the other mechs began reporting back, I'd managed to get all of her parts stowed away in my locker. The next day, I went to San Francisco and brought back with me 2 rolls of lead foil. While the other servos were on pass, I wrapped the parts carefully in it so the radioactivity from Elizabeth's pile wouldn't be picked up. The rest you know, gentlemen," murmured Frank in a low, electrical tones. "Each time I made a trip, I carried another piece of Elizabeth out here concealed in an ordinary parts box. It took me nearly a year to accumulate all of her for an assembly." When the big servo had finished, he signed the statement Wynne had taken down in his notebook. I think even the 2 inspectors were a little moved by the story, because Robert said, "Okay, 19, you gave us a break, we'll give you one. 8 o'clock in the morning. Be ready to roll for Earth. Meanwhile, you can stay here." The next morning, only the 2 inspectors and Frank 19 were standing by the airlock. "Wait a minute," I said. "Aren't you taking the girl mech too?" "Not allowed to "Not allowed to tamper with the other company's robots," Wynne said. 19 gave us a signed confession, so we didn't need the girl as a witness. You'll have to contact her employers." That same day, Min got off a radargram to Earth explaining to the Automavare people how a robot employee of theirs had turned up out here, and what did they want us to do about it. The reply we received read, "Rationaloid DX78-947 Elizabeth, low efficiency worker. Have replaced. Dispose as you see fit. Transfer papers forwarded earliest in compliance with law. The poor thing, said Min. She'll have a hard time getting another job. Robots have to have such good records. I tell you what, I said, we'll hire her. You could use some help with the housework. So we put the girl mech right to work making the guests' beds and helping Min in the kitchen. I guess she was grateful for the job, but when work was done, and there wasn't anything for her to do, she just stood in front of a viewport with her slender plastic arms folded over her waist. Min and I knew she was rerunning her memory tapes of Frank. A week later, the publicity started. Minor Planets must have let the story leak out somehow, because when the mail rocket dropped off the Bay Area papers, there was Frank's picture plastered all over page 1 with follow-up stories inside. I read some of the headlines to Min. Bear love nest in space. Mech Romeo fired by Minor Planets. Test case opens at Robot Court. Electronics experts probe robot love urge. The IO wasn't mentioned, but later Minor Planets must have released the whole thing officially, because a bunch of reporters and photographers rocketed out to interview us and snap a lot of pictures of Elizabeth. We worried for a while about how the publicity would affect our business relations with Minor Planets, but nothing happened. Back on Earth, Frank 19 leaped into the public eye overnight. There was something about the story that appealed to people. At first, it looked pretty bad for Frank. The state prosecutor at Robot Court had his signed confession of theft and, what was worse, robot fraternization. But then, near the end of the trial, a young scientist named Scott introduced some new evidence, and the case was remanded to the Sacramento Court of Appeals. It was Scott's testimony that saved Frank from the junk pile. The big servo got off with only a light sentence for theft because the judge ruled that in the light of Scott's new findings, robots came under human law and therefore no infraction of justice had been committed. Working independently in his own laboratory, Scott had proved that the magnetic flux lines in male and female robot systems, while at first deteriorating to both, were actually behaving according to the para-emotional theories of von Bohler. Scott termed the condition hysteric puppy love, which, he claimed, had many of the advantages of human love if allowed to develop freely. Well, neither Min nor I pretended we understood all his equations, but they sure made a stir among the scientists. Frank kept getting more and more publicity. First, we heard he was serving his sentence in the Mech Correction Center at La Jolla. I think it's La Jolla, actually. Then we got a report that he'd turned up in Hollywood. Later, it came out that Galactavision Pictures hired Frank for a film and had gone 10,000 bail for him. $10,000 bail for him. Not long after that, he was getting billed all over Terra as the sensational first robot star. All during the production of Forbidden Robot Love, Frank remained lead copy for the newspapers. Reporters liked to write him up as the Valentino of the robots. Frank 19 fan clubs, usually formed by lonely female robots against their employers' wishes, sprang up spontaneously through the East and Middle West. Then somebody found out Frank could sing, and the human teenagers began to go for him. It got so everywhere you looked and everything you read, there was Frank staring you in the face. Frank in tweeds on the golf course, Frank at Ciro's, or Frank at the Brown Derby in evening clothes. Frank posing in his sports jetabout against a blue Pacific background. Meanwhile, everybody forgot about Elizabeth 7. The movie producers had talked about hiring her as Frank's leading lady until they found out about a new line of female robots that had just gone on the market. When they screen tested the whole series and picked a lovely Mylar rationaloid named Diana 12, it hit Elizabeth pretty hard. She began to let herself go after that, and Min and I didn't have the heart to say anything to her. It was pretty obvious she wasn't oiling herself properly, her hair wasn't brushed, and she didn't seem to care when one of her photons went dead. When Forbidden Robot Love premiered simultaneously in Hollywood and New York, the critics all gave it rave reviews. There were pictures of Diana 12 and Frank making guest appearances all over the country. Back at the IO, we got in the habit of letting Elizabeth watch TV with us sometimes in the renting office, and one night there happened to be an interview with Frank and Diana at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas. I guess seeing the pretty robot starlet and her Frank sitting so close together in the nightclub must have made the girl mech feel pretty bad. Even then, she didn't say a word against the big servo. She just never watched the set again after that. When we tabbed up the IO's receipts that year, they were so good, Min and I decided to get a month off for an Earthside vacation. Min's retired brother in Berkeley was nice enough to come out and look after the place for us while we spent 4 solid weeks soaking up the sun in Southern California. When we got back out to the spotel, though, I could see there was something wrong by the look on Jim's face. "It's that robot girl of yours, Bill," he said. "She's gone and deactivated herself." We went right to 22A and found Elizabeth 7 stretched out on the floor. There was a screwdriver clutched in her hand, and the relay banks on her inner side were exposed and horribly blackened. Crazy mech shorted out her own DX. Min and I knew why. After Jim left for Earth, we dismantled Elizabeth the best we could and put her back in Frank's old locker. We didn't know what else to do with her. Anyway, the slack season came and went before long, and before long we were doing spring cleaning again, and wondering how heavy the Jovian Moons trade was going to be. I remember I'd been making some repairs outside and was just hanging up my spacesuit in the renting office when I heard the radar announcing a ship. It was the biggest Marvin 990 I'd ever seen that finally suctioned up to the boom and secured. I couldn't take my eyes off the ship. It was pretty near the last word in rockets and loaded with accessories. It took me a minute or two before I noticed all the faces looking out of the viewports. "Min," I whispered, "there's something funny about those faces. They look like robots." Min answered, "Bill, that 990 is full of mechs." Just as she said it, a bulky figure in white space fatigue swung out of the hatch and hurried up the gangplank. Seconds later, it burst through the airlock. "Frank 19!" we gasped together. "Please, where is Elizabeth?" he hummed anxiously. "Is she all right? I have to know." Frank stood perfectly still when I told him about Elizabeth's self-deactivation. Then a pitiful shudder went through him and he covered his face with his big neoprene hands. "I was afraid of that," he said barely audibly. "Where you haven't." "No," I said. "She's where you always kept her." With that, the big servo pilot took off for 22A like a berserk robot, and we were right behind him. We watched him tear open his old locker and gently lay out the girl mech's parts so he could study them. After a minute or two, he gave a long sigh and said, "Fortunately, it's not as bad as I thought. I believe I can fix her." Frank worked hard over the blackened relays for 20 minutes. Then he set the unit aside and began assembling the girl. When the final connections were made and the damaged unit installed, he flicked on her power. We waited, and nothing happened. 5 minutes went by. 10. Slowly, the big robot turned away, his broad shoulders drooping slightly. "I've failed," he said quietly. "Her DX doesn't respond to the gain." The girl mech, in her blue dress, lay there motionless where Frank had been working on her, as the servo pilot muttered over and over, "It's my fault. I did this to you." Then Min shouted, "Wait! I heard something!" There was a slow click of a relay, and movement. Painfully, Elizabeth 7 rose on one elbow and looked around her. "Frank, darling," she murmured, shaking her head, "I know you're just old memory tape. It's all I have left." "Elizabeth, it's really me. I've come to take you away. We're going to be together from now on." "You, Frank? This isn't just old feedback?"
You've come back to me?
Forever, darling. Elizabeth, do you remember what I said about those wonderful green little worlds, the asteroids? Darling, we're going to one of them. You and the others will love Alinda, I know you will. I've been there many times.
Frank, is your DX all right? What are you talking about?
How stupid of me, darling. You haven't heard. Elizabeth, thanks to Dr. Scott, Congress has passed robot civil rights. And that movie I made helped swing public opinion to our side. We are free. The minute I heard the news, I applied to Interplanetary for homestead rights on Alinda. I made arrangements to buy a ship with the money I'd earned, and then I put ads in all the robot wanted columns for volunteer colonizers. You should have seen the response. We've got 30 robot couples aboard now, and more coming later. Darling, we're the first pioneer wave of free robots. On board, we have tons of supplies and parts. Everything we need for building a sound robot culture.
Frank 19, said the girl mech suddenly. I should be furious with you. You and that Diana 12, I thought.
The big servo gave a flat, whirring laugh. Ha, ha, Diana and me. But that was all publicity, darling. Why, right at the start of the filming, Diana fell in love with Sam 17, one of the other actors. They're on board now.
Robot civilization, murmured the girl after a minute. Oh, Frank, that means robot government, robot art, robot science.
And robot marriage, hummed Frank softly. There has to be robot law, too. I've thought it all out. As skipper of the first robot-owned rocket, I'm entitled to marry couples in deep space at their request.
But who marries us, darling? You can't do it yourself.
I thought of that, too, said Frank, turning to me. This human gentleman has every right to marry us. He's in command of a moving body in space, just like the captain of a ship. It's perfectly legal. I looked it up in the articles of space. Will you do it, sir? Well, what could I say when Frank dug into his fatigues and handed me a Gideon prayer book marked at the marriage service? Elizabeth and Frank said their I do's right there in the renting office, while the other robot colonizers looked on. Maybe it was the way I read the service. Maybe I should have been a preacher, I don't know. Anyway, when I pronounced Elizabeth and Frank robot and wife, that whole bunch of lovesick mechs wanted me to do the job for them, too. Big copper work robots, small aluminum salesgirls mechs, plastoid clerks and typists, squatty little mummital lab servos, rationaloids, non-rationaloids, and just plain sub-robots, all shapes and sizes. They all wanted individual ceremonies, too. It took till noon the next day before the last couple was hitched and the 990 left for Alinda. Like I said, the spotel business isn't so different from the motel game back in California. Sure, you got improvements to make, but a new sideline can get to be pretty profitable if you get in on the ground floor. Min and I got to thinking of all those robot colonizers who'd be coming out here. Interplanetary cleared the license just last week. Min framed it herself and hung it next to our orbit license in the renting office. She says a lot of motel owners do all right as justices of the peace. And that was The Love of Frank 19 by David C. Knight. That was charming. That was cute. I liked that one. In hindsight, I don't think I would stick to the robot voice like that again, because that was after that like one really long monologue, I was dying. I was like, I can't keep doing this, but I did it anyway. Alrighty, what are we looking at for time? I have time for another one. It's a gorgeous day here. Definitely want to get on a bike ride, but I gotta get some reading in here. Here we go. What do we got? What do we got? Oh, come on, no. Eh. This thing isn't doing what I'm expecting it to do. It's acting weird. So give me a sec to get this thing sorted. There we go. Okay. Here we go. This is another one I haven't read before. Who's this by? Ah, here we go. This is one called The Jupiter Weapon. With a title like The Jupiter Weapon, how bad can it be, am I right? That's what I say. That's what we look for in these pulps, is a little bit of corniness. If it's a bit corny, it's good. Preferably well written. That is always preferable. And having some entertaining premise. That's always the goal. We are here to entertain. Excuse me. Alrighty. The Jupiter Weapon by Charles L. Fontenay. He was a living weapon of destruction, immeasurably powerful, utterly invulnerable. There was only one question. Was he human? Trella feared she was in for trouble even before Motwick's head dropped forward on his arms in a drunken stupor. The two evil-looking men at the table nearby had been watching her surreptitiously, and now they shifted restlessly in their chairs. Trella had not wanted to come to the Golden Satellite. It was a squalid saloon in the rougher section of Jupiter's View, the terrestrial dome colony on Ganymede. Motwick, already drunk, had insisted. A woman could not possibly make her way through these streets alone to the better section of town, especially one clad in a silvery evening dress. Her only hope was that this place had a telephone. Perhaps she could call one of Motwick's friends. She had no one on Ganymede she could call a real friend herself. Tentatively, she pushed her chair back from the table and arose. She had to brush close by the other table to get to the bar. As she did, the dark, slick-haired man reached out and grabbed her around the waist with a steely arm. Trella swung with her whole body and slapped him so hard he nearly fell from his chair. As she walked swiftly toward the bar, he leaped up to follow her. There were only two other people in the Golden Satellite, the fat, mustached bartender and a short, square-built man at the bar. The latter swung around at the pistol-like report of her slap, and she saw that, though no more than 4.5 feet tall, he was as heavily muscled as a lion. His face was clean and open, with close-cropped blond hair and honest blue eyes. She ran to him. "Help me!" she cried. "Please help me!" He began to back away from her. "I can't," he muttered in a deep voice. "I can't help you. I can't do anything." The dark man was at her heels. In desperation, she dodged around the short man and took refuge behind him. Her protector was obviously unwilling, But the dark man, faced with his massiveness, took no chances. He stopped and shouted, "Craig!" The other man at the table arose, ponderously, and lumbered toward them. He was immense, at least 6.5 feet tall, with a brutal, vacant face. Evading her attempts to stay behind him, the squat man began to move down the bar, away from the approaching Craig. The dark man moved in on Trella again, as Craig overtook his quarry and swung a huge fist like a sledgehammer. Exactly what happened, Trella wasn't sure. She had the impression that Craig's fist connected squarely with the short man's chin before he dodged to one side in a movement so fast it was a blur. But that couldn't have been, because the short man wasn't moved by that blow that would have felled a steer, and Craig roared in pain, grabbing his injured fist. "The bar!" yelled Craig. "I hit the damn bar!" At this juncture, the bartender took a hand. Leaning far over the bar, he swung a full bottle in a complete arc. It smashed on Craig's head, splashing the floor with liquor, and Craig sank stunned to his knees. The dark man, who grabbed Trella's arm, released her and ran for the door. Moving agilely around the end of the bar, the bartender stood over Craig, holding the jagged-edged bottleneck in his hand menacingly. "Get out!" rumbled the bartender. "I'll have no coppers raiding my place for the likes of you." Craig stumbled to his feet and staggered out. Trella ran to the unconscious Motwick's side. "That means you too, lady," said the bartender beside her. "You and your boyfriend get out of here. You oughtn't to have come here in the first place." "May I help you, miss?" asked a deep, resonant voice beside her. She straightened from her anxious examination of Motwick. The squat man was standing there, an apologetic look on his face. She looked contemptuously at the massive muscles whose help had been denied her. Her arm ached where the dark man had grasped it. The broad face before her was not unhandsome, and the blue eyes were disconcertingly direct, but she despised him for a coward. "I'm sorry I couldn't fight those men for you, miss, but I just couldn't," he said miserably, as though reading her thoughts. "But no one will bother you on the street if I'm with you."
"A lot of protection you'd be if they did," she snapped. "But I'm desperate. You can carry him to the Stellar Hotel for me."
The gravity of Ganymede was hardly more than that of Earth's moon, but the way the man picked up the limp Motwick with one hand and tossed him over a shoulder was startling, as though he'd lifted a feather pillow. He followed Trella out the door of the Golden Satellite and fell in step beside her. Immediately she was grateful for his presence. The dimly lighted street was not crowded, but she didn't like the looks of the men she saw. The transparent dome of Jupiter's view was faintly visible in the reflected night lights of the colonial city, but the lights were overwhelmed by the giant varicolored disk of Jupiter itself, riding high in the sky. "I'm Quest Mansard, miss," said her companion. "I'm just in from Jupiter."
"I'm Trella Nuspar," she said, favoring him with a green-eyed glance. "You mean Io, don't you? Or Moon 5?"
"No," he said, grinning at her. He had an engaging grin, with white, even teeth. "I meant Jupiter."
"You're lying," she said flatly. "No one has ever landed on Jupiter. It would be impossible to blast off again."
"My parents landed on Jupiter, and I blasted off from it," he said soberly. "I was born there. Have you ever heard of Dr. Erickland Mansard?"
"I certainly have," she said, interest taking a suddenly upward turn. "He developed the surgiscope, didn't he? But his ship was drawn into Jupiter and lost."
"It was drawn into Jupiter, but he landed it successfully," said Quest. "He and my mother lived on Jupiter until the oxygen equipment wore out at last. I was born and brought up there, and I was finally able to build a small rocket with a powerful enough drive to clear the planet." She looked at him. He was short, half a head shorter than she, but broad and powerful as a man might be who had grown up in heavy gravity. He trod the street with a light, controlled step, seeming to deliberately hold himself down. If Dr. Mansard succeeded in landing on Jupiter, why didn't anyone hear from him again? She demanded. Because, said Quest, his radio was sabotaged, just as his ship's drive was. Jupiter's strength, she murmured, looking him over coolly. You wear Motwick on your shoulder like a scarf, but you couldn't bring yourself to help a woman against two thugs. He flushed. I'm sorry, he said. That's something I couldn't help. Why not? I don't know. It's not that I'm afraid, but there's something in me that makes me back away from the prospect of fighting anyone. Trella sighed. Cowardice was a state of mind. It was peculiarly inappropriate, but not unbelievable that the strongest and most agile man on Ganymede should be a coward. Well, she thought with a rush of sympathy, he couldn't help being what he was. They had reached the more brightly lighted section of the city by now. Charla could get a cab from here, but the Stellar Hotel wasn't far. They walked on. Trella had the desk clerk call a cab to deliver the unconscious Motwick to his home. She and Quest had a late sandwich in the coffee shop. I landed here only a week ago, he told her, his eyes frankly admiring her honey-colored hair and comely face. I'm heading for Earth on the next spaceship. We'll be traveling companions then, she said. I'm going back on that ship too. For some reason, she decided against telling him that the assignment on which she had come to the Jupiter system was to gather his own father's notebooks and take them back to Earth. Motwick was an irresponsible playboy whom Trella had known briefly on Earth, and Trella was glad to dispense with his company for the remaining 3 weeks before the spaceship blasted off. She found herself enjoying the steadier companionship of Quest. As a matter of fact, she found herself enjoying his companionship more than she intended to. She found herself falling in love with him. Now, this did not suit her at all. Trella had always liked her men tall and dark. She had determined that when she was married, it would be to a curly-haired 6-footer. She was not at all happy about being so strongly attracted to a man several inches shorter than she. She was particularly unhappy about feeling drawn to a man who was a coward. The ship that they boarded on Moon 9 was one of the newer ships that could attain 100-mile-per-second velocity and take a hyperbolic path to Earth, but it would still require 54 days to make the trip. So Trella was delighted to find that the ship was the Comet-Fire and its skipper was her old friend, dark-eyed, curly-haired Jack Dane Gill. Jack Dane, she said, flirting with him with her eyes as in days gone by. I need a chaperone this trip, and you're ideal for the job. I never thought of myself in quite that light, but maybe I'm getting old, he answered, laughing. What's your trouble, Trella? I'm in love with that huge chunk of man who came aboard with me, and I'm not sure I ought to be, she confessed. I may need protection against myself till we get to Earth. If it's to keep you out of another fellow's clutches, I'm your man, agreed Jack Dane heartily. I'd always had a mind to save you from myself. I'll guarantee you won't have a moment alone with him the whole trip. You don't have to be that thorough about it, she protested hastily. I want to get a little enjoyment out of being in love, but I feel myself weakening too much, I'll holler for help. The Comet-Fire swung around Great Jupiter in an opening arc and plummeted ever more swiftly toward the tight circles of the inner planets. There were 4 crew members and 3 passengers aboard the ship's tiny personnel sphere, and Trella was thrown in with Quest almost constantly. She enjoyed every minute of it. She told him that she was a messenger, sent out to Ganymede to pick up some important papers and then take them back to Earth. She was tempted to tell him what the papers were. Her employer had impressed upon her that her mission was confidential, but surely Dom Blessing could not object to Dr. Mansard's son knowing about it. All these things had happened before she was born, and she did not know what Dom Blessing's relation to Dr. Mansard had been, but it must have been very close. She knew that Dr. Mansard had invented the surgiscope. This was an instrument with a three-dimensional screen at its heart. The screen was a cubical frame in which an apparently solid image was built up of an object under an electron microscope. The actual cutting instrument of the surgiscope was an ion stream. By operating a tool in the three-dimensional screen, corresponding movements were made by the ion stream on the object under the microscope. The principle was the same as that used in the operation of remote control hands in atomic laboratories to handle hot material, and with the surgiscope, very delicate operations could be performed at the cellular level. Dr. Mansard and his wife had disappeared into the turbulent atmosphere of Jupiter just after his invention of the surgiscope, and it had been developed by Dom Blessing. Its success had built Spaceway Instruments, Incorporated, which Blessing headed. Through all these years since Dr. Mansard's disappearance, Blessing had been searching the Jovian moons for a second hidden laboratory of Dr. Mansard. When it was found at last, he sent Trella, his most trusted secretary, to Ganymede to bring back to him the notebooks found there. Blessing would, of course, be happy to learn that a son of Dr. Mansard lived, and would see that he received his rightful share of the inheritance. Because of this, Trella was tempted to tell Quest the good news herself, but she decided against it. It was Blessing's privilege to do this his own way, and he might not appreciate her meddling. At mid-trip, Trella made a rueful confession to Jack Dane. "It seems I was taking unnecessary precautions when I asked you to be a chaperone," she said. "I kept waiting for Quest to do something, and when he didn't, I told him I loved him." "What did he say?" "It's very peculiar," she said unhappily. "He said he can't love me. He said he wants to love me, and he feels that he should, but there's something in him that refuses to permit it." She expected Jack Dane to salve her wounded feelings with a sympathetic pleasantry, but he did not. Instead, he just looked at her very thoroughly, very thoughtfully, and said no more about the matter. He explained his attitude after Asranj run amuck. Asranj was the third passenger. He was a lean, saturnine individual who said little and kept to himself as much as possible. He was distantly polite in his relations with both crew and the other passengers, and never showed the slightest spark of emotion, until the day Quest squirted coffee on him. It was one of those accidents that can occur easily in space. The passengers and the two crewmen on that particular waking shift, including Jack Dane, were eating lunch on the center deck. Quest picked up his bulb of coffee, but inadvertently pressed it before he got it to his lips. The coffee squirted all over the front of Asranj's clean white tunic. "I'm sorry," exclaimed Quest in distress. The man's eyes went wide, and he snarled. So quickly it seemed impossible he had unbuckled himself from his seat and had hurled himself backward from the table with an incoherent cry. He seized the first object his hand touched. It happened to be a very heavy wooden cane leaning against Jack Dane's bunk, propelled himself like a projectile at Quest. Quest rose from the table in a sudden uncoiling of movement. He did not unbuckle his safety belt. He rose, and it snapped like a string. For a moment, Trella thought he was going to meet Asranj's assault. But he fled in a long leap toward the companionway leading to the astrogation deck above. Landing feet first in the middle of the table and rebounding, Asranj pursued him with the stick upraised. In his haste, Quest missed the companionway in his leap and was cornered against one of the bunks. Asranj descended on him like an avenging angel, and, holding onto the bunk with one hand, rained savage blows on his head and shoulders with the heavy stick. Quest made no effort to retaliate. He cowered under the attack, holding his hands in front of him as if to ward it off. In a moment, Jack Dane and the other crewmen had reached Asranj and pulled him off. When they had Asranj in irons, Jack Dane turned to Quest, who was now sitting unhappily at the table. "Take it easy," he advised. "I'll wake the psychosurgeon, and I'll have him look you over. Just stay there." Quest shook his head. "Don't bother him. he said. It's nothing but a few bruises. Bruises? Man, that club could have broken your skull, or a couple of ribs at the very least. I'm all right, insisted Quest, and when the skeptical Jack Dane insisted on examining him carefully, he had to admit it. There was hardly a mark on him from the blows. If it didn't hurt you any more than that, why didn't you take the stick away from him? Demanded Jack Dane. You could have, easily. I couldn't, said Quest miserably, and turned his face away. Later, alone with Trella on the control deck, Jack Dane gave her some sober advice. If you think you're in love with Quest, forget it, he said.
Why? Because he's a coward? I know that ought to make me despise him, but it doesn't anymore.
Not because he's a coward. Because he's an android.
What? Jack Dane, you can't be serious.
I am. I say he's an android, an artificial imitation of a man. It all figures. Look, Trella, he said he was born on Jupiter. A human could stand the gravity of Jupiter inside a dome or a ship, but what human could stand the rocket acceleration necessary to break free of Jupiter? Here's a man strong enough to break a spaceship's safety belt just by getting up out of his chair against it, tough enough to take a beating with a heavy stick without being injured. How can you believe he's really human? Trella remembered the thug, Craig, striking Quest in the face, and then crying that he had injured his hand on the bar.
But he said Dr. Mansard was his father, protested Trella.
Robots and androids frequently look on their makers as their parents, said Jack Dane. Quest may not even know he's artificial. Do you know how Mansard died?
The oxygen equipment failed, Quest said.
Yes. Do you know when?
No, Quest never did tell me, that I remember.
He told me, a year before Quest made his rocket flight to Ganymede. If the oxygen equipment failed, how do you think Quest lived in the poisonous atmosphere of Jupiter if he's human?
Trella was silent.
For the protection of humans, there are two psychological traits built into every robot and android, said Jack Dane gently. The first is that they can never, under any circumstances, attack a human being, even in self-defense. The second is that, while they may understand sexual desire objectively, they can never experience it themselves. Those characteristics fit your man Quest to a T, Trella. There is no other explanation for him. He must be an android. Trella did not want to believe Jack Dane was right, but his reasoning was unassailable. Looking upon Quest as an android, many things were explained. His great strength, his short, broad build, his immunity to injury, his refusal to defend himself against a human, his inability to return Trella's love for him. It was not inconceivable that she should have unknowingly fallen in love with an android. Humans could love androids with real affection, even knowing that they were artificial. There were instances of android nursemaids who were virtually members of the families owning them. She was glad now that she had not told Quest of her mission to Ganymede. He thought he was Dr. Mansard's son, but an android had no legal right of inheritance from his owner. She would leave it to Dom Blessing to decide what to do about Quest. Thus, she did not, as she intended originally, speak to Quest about seeing him again after how she had completed her assignment. Even if Jack Dane was wrong and Quest was human, as now seemed unlikely, Quest had told her he could not love her. Her best course was to try and forget him. Nor did Quest try to arrange with her for a later meeting. It has been pleasant knowing you, Trella, he said when they left the G-boat at White Sands. A faraway look came into his blue eyes, and he added, I'm sorry things couldn't have been different, somehow.
Let's don't be sorry for what we can't help, she said gently, taking his hand in farewell.
Trella took a fast plane from White Sands, and 24 hours later walked up the front steps of the familiar brownstone house on the outskirts of Washington. Dom Blessing himself met her at the door, a stooped, graying man who peered at her over his spectacles. You have the papers, eh? He said, spying the briefcase. Good, good. Come in and we'll see what we have, eh? She accompanied him through the bare, windowless anteroom, which had always seemed to her such a strange feature of this luxurious house, and they entered the big living room. They sat before a fire in the old-fashioned fireplace, and Blessing opened the briefcase with trembling hands. "There are things here," he said, his eyes sparkling as he glanced through the notebooks. "Yes, there are things here. We shall make something of these, Miss Trella, eh?" "I'm glad you think that there's something you can use, Mr. Blessing," she said. "There's something else I found on my trip that I think I should tell you about." She told him about Quest. "He thinks he's the son of Dr. Mansard," she finished, "but apparently he is, without knowing it, an android Dr. Mansard built on Jupiter." "He came back to Earth with you, eh?" asked Blessing intently. "Yes, I'm afraid it's your decision whether to let him go on living as a man or tell him he's an android and claim ownership as Dr. Mansard's heir." Trella planned to spend a few days resting in her employer's spacious home and then to take a short vacation before resuming her duties as his confidential secretary. The next morning, when she came down from her room, a change had been made. Two armed men were with Dom Blessing at breakfast and accompanied him wherever he went. She discovered that the two more men with that I cannot talk today. She discovered that two more men with guns were stationed in the bare anteroom, and a guard was stationed at every entrance to the house. "Why all the protection?" she asked Blessing. "A wealthy man must be careful," said Blessing cheerfully. "When we don't understand all the implications of new circumstances, we must be prepared for anything, eh?" There was only one new circumstance Trella could think of. Without actually intending to, she exclaimed, "You aren't afraid of Quest? Why, an android can't hurt a human." Blessing peered at her over his spectacles. "And what if he isn't an android, eh? And if he is, what if old Mansard didn't build in the prohibition against harming humans that's required by law? What about that, eh?" Trella was silent, shocked. There was something here, something she hadn't known about, hadn't even suspected. For some reason, Dom Blessing feared Dr. Ericland Mansard, or his heir, or his mechanical servant. She was sure that Blessing was wrong, that Quest, whether man or android, intended no harm to him. Surely Quest would have said something of such bitterness during their long time together on Ganymede and a space, since he did not know of Trella's connection with Blessing. But since this was to be the atmosphere of Blessing's house, she was glad that he decided to assign her to take the Mansard papers to the New York laboratory. Quest came the day before she was scheduled to leave. Trella was in the living room with Blessing, discussing the instructions she was to give the laboratory officials in New York. The two bodyguards were with them. The other guards were at their posts. Trella heard the doorbell ring. The heavy oaken front door was kept locked now, and the guards in the anteroom examined callers through a tiny window. Suddenly, alarm bells rang all over the house. There was a terrific crash outside the room as the front door splintered. There were shouts and the sound of a shot. "The steel doors!" cried Blessing, turning white. "Let's get out of here!" He and his bodyguards ran through the back of the house, out of the garage. Blessing, ahead of the rest, leaped into one of the cars and started the engine. The door from the house shattered, and Quest burst through. The two guards turned and fired together. He could be hurt by bullets. He was staggered momentarily. Then, in a blur of motion, he sprang forward and swept the guards aside with one hand with such force that they skidded across the floor and lay in an unconscious heap against the rear of the garage. Trella had opened the door of the car, but it was wrenched from her hand as Blessing stepped on the accelerator, and it leaped into the driveway with spinning wheels. Quest was after it, like a chunky deer, running faster than Trella had ever seen a man run before. Blessing slowed for the turn at the end of the driveway and glanced back over his shoulder. Seeing Quest almost upon him, he slammed down the accelerator and twisted the wheel hard. The car whipped into the street, careened, and rolled over and over, bringing up against a tree on the other side in a twisted tangle of wreckage. With a horrified gasp, Trella ran down the driveway toward the smoking heap of metal. Quest was already beside it, probing it. As she reached his side, he lifted the torn body of Dom Blessing. Blessing was dead. "I'm lucky," said Quest soberly. "I would have murdered him." "But why, Quest? I knew he was afraid of you, but he didn't tell me why." "It was conditioned into me," answered Quest. "I didn't know it until just now, when it ended, but my father conditioned me psychologically from my birth to the task of hunting down Dom Blessing and killing him. It was an unconscious drive in me that wouldn't release me until the task was finished. You see, Blessing was my father's assistant on Ganymede. Right after my father completed development of the surgiscope, he and my mother blasted off for Io. Blessing wanted the valuable rights to the surgiscope, and he sabotaged the ship's drive so it would fall into Jupiter. But my father was able to control it in the heavy atmosphere of Jupiter and landed it successfully. I was born there, and he would condition me to come to Earth and track down Blessing. I know now that it was part of the conditioning that I was unable to fight any other man until my task was finished. It might have gotten me in trouble and diverted me from that purpose." More gently than Trella would have believed possible for his Jupiter-strong muscles, Quest took her in his arms. "Now I can say I love you," he said. "That was part of my conditioning, too. I couldn't love any woman until my job was done." Trella disengaged herself. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't you know this, too, now? That you're not a man, but an android?" He looked at her in astonishment, stunned by her words. "What in space makes you think that?" he demanded. "Why, Quest, it's obvious!" she cried, tears in her eyes. "Everything about you, your build, suited for Jupiter's gravity, your strength, the fact that you were able to live in Jupiter's atmosphere after the oxygen equipment failed. I know you think Dr. Mansard was your father, but androids often believe that." He grinned at her. "I'm no android," he said confidently. "Do you forget my father was inventor of the surgiscope? He knew I'd have to grow up on Jupiter, and he operated on the genes before I was born. He altered my inherited characteristics to adapt me to the climate of Jupiter, even to being able to breathe a chlorine atmosphere as well as an oxygen atmosphere." Trella looked at him. He was not badly hurt, any more than an elephant would have been, but his tunic was stained with red blood where the bullets had struck him. Normal android blood was green. "How can you be sure?" she asked doubtfully. "Androids are made," he answered with a laugh. "They don't grow up, and I remember my boyhood on Jupiter very well." He took her in his arms again, and this time she did not resist. His lips were very human. The end. And that was The Jupiter Weapon by Charles L. Fontenay. That one was cute too. It was a romp, dated, but a romp. Let me see if I can find the date on that one. Where's the date? Oh, come on now. I do not see a date. See when it was added to Project Gutenberg. I don't see the date. Where are you, date? Me. Oh, maybe I can. Do, 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 do. Nope. Nope, nope, nope. That doesn't help me at all. Nope, nope, nope. Nope, 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 nope. I'll check to see if it's on the Gutenberg page. Nope. do a quick little Wikipedia then. See if I get lucky. Let's try Fontenay. Charles Fontenay. Ah, here we go. Charles Louis Fontenay, science fiction writer. The Jupiter Weapon, 1959. That's when the Jupiter Weapon was written. Pretty good, considering. Actually, the math, I'm not 100%, but I think the time frame that they had, 54 days, and they were moving at 100 miles per second or meters per second. No, it's not going to find it there. Let me see if I can find the ship. 54 days. I don't know the math off the top of my head, but that sounds actually. Oh, no, no, that's too slow. I take it back. 100 mile per second. I don't actually know the distance off my head. If it was uh, close to Earth, I think that would be possible. That's a thing you don't always have taken into account with a lot of even realistic science fiction. Um, is the distance between Earth and Jupiter, or Earth and another planet, or a planet and another planet, two celestial bodies within the same solar system, is not consistent. It changes based on where it is in its orbit. So, cool stuff. And they tend not to make mention of that, unfortunately. So sometimes a planet can be on the other side of the sun and therefore would not be capable of communicating. So yeah, that one was cute. I think I am going to have to call it quits at that one though for today. But next week I will have a bunch ready. And there are a bunch here. I hope people are enjoying these. I love doing this. This is a lot of fun for me. It's very relaxing. All right. Thanks for tuning in if you did. If you didn't tune in, please feel free to tune in. Otherwise, I'll see you next week. I do have my Mecha Monday stream on Monday, and my Warframe Wednesday stream on Wednesday. Same time, same place. All right. Thanks again and have a good one. Bye, folks.